In the first place, I think it's a laudable idea, but we must understand a number of things when it comes to listing on the exchange and for the small businesses. If you look at the peculiarity of our market, the Nigerian market, the access to finance and the access to funds for small and medium enterprises is quite limited. And right now, the government and a number of private sector and banks typically are trying to put together funds to deal with that. So if you look at the way the market is structured today around the major industries, if you leave the small and medium enterprise, the regulations, the requirements to get on board the stock exchange and all of that, it's not as easy as walking into the bank to try and get lending and things like that. So before you have a small or medium scale, a small or medium business get on the exchange to generate capital, there are a number of things around their books, their financials, the way they are structured, their business profile and all of that. So it's something that we might get to, but one of the reasons why you haven't seen a lot of traction in that market is the ability to put together a proper structure around the small and medium enterprise. For the high up institutional and corporates, they already have financials, they have structures that can enable them access the market. But I think in the first place, we need to have a lot more cohesion around the small and medium enterprise, get their businesses to get to a point where they have access to some form of funding to put the structures together. Then they can reach out to the capital market and get investors to get into that space. So because okay?
Sorry to cut in, but in the meantime, one can imagine that these small businesses will continue to tap the banking sector. And at the moment, many of them speak to the high interest rate environment. And I want to get your thoughts on whether or not you think that could even get higher. I want you to speak to your expectations ahead of the MPC next week. What do you think is likely to happen at the meeting?
Now, we need to understand today that if you look at it in terms of interest rates, there are a number of interventions coming up from the government. You have developmental funds and others trying to bring the interest rates on their obligations lower. So to a large extent, there's so much support from the government and governmental agencies to give them access to credit. Now, in terms of what the MPC will likely do next week, there's no doubt in my mind that the government have been pushing an agenda, or CBN, as a matter of fact, have been pushing an agenda to reach out to the small and medium enterprise within the system. You will see from BOI funds, Development Bank of Nigeria recently is targeting that sector. The CBN is also targeting that sector. The agri funds and all of that were specifically put together for that sector. Because truth be told, you really can have a very viable economy if you have the small and the medium players completely cut out of access to credit. So the whole idea for me is the CBN, the MPC, even the government will continue to do what it takes to get these guys on board the system. And that's why I said initially that the more they have access to some form of credit to create a structure, an ideal financial system for them, so they can have records, they can have proper bookkeeping, they can have cash flow projections and all of that, then it's easier for investors to come in and invest there. But until we get them to a point where they are properly structured and packaged to access that market, we'll continue to have them tied to the aprons of the banks and all of that. Yeah. But by and large, I think there's so much support, even from the banking system today, to see how we can get our funds to them, relax some of the requirements and all of that, so that these guys can have access to funding.
Well, Uche, one outcome of the last meeting clearly is the arrangement where banks were allowed to tap their cash reserve ratio at the central bank on the condition that that money is made available to businesses that are investing in new projects, and of course that will come at a concessionary interest rate of less than 10%. Can you speak to the early signs that that is working out, or are we seeing any mobilization of funds to those small businesses right now as a result of that policy, or is it too early to begin to expect that to happen?
I think in the first place it's a little too early, but what is clear is that there's a number of requests coming across the banks from these customers to access that fund. But again, we must understand that we need to put structures in place internally to see how we can get them on board. But clearly, it's something the banks are looking at doing. It's something we're working very closely with the central bank. Don't forget, the credit risk for those obligations will still sit with the banks. So it's important that we profile the customers right, package them properly in such a way that they can have access to the finance, because today the CRR stays with central bank at 0. So if we're able to deal with the credit risk aspect of it and get these customers on board to access the funds, it will be a win-win at the end of the day. But the real tricky issue is how to deal with the credit risk associated with that segment of the market. But I can tell you categorically that a lot is happening. There's a lot of engagement with the customers and the central bank to see how we can put this in place and allow them access to funds.